Emma had always believed that kindness would protect her, that doing the right thing meant safety in a world that often felt cruel. She watched from her bedroom window as an elderly blind man struggled at the crosswalk, his white cane trembling against the curb, and something inside her whispered that this moment mattered more than she could understand. Her stepmother, Victoria, had warned her that morning with eyes like shattered glass. "Stay out of sight, stay quiet, and maybe you'll eat tonight." But Emma couldn't ignore the vulnerability of the old man as cars rushed past him without mercy. The moment Emma took his arm and guided him across the road, she felt a strange electricity in his grip, as though he could see straight through to the goodness she kept hidden from her stepmother's rage. Victoria arrived home early that afternoon, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood like a countdown to disaster. And when she discovered Emma had left the house against orders, the beating came swift and merciless, each strike punctuated with accusations of disobedience. The basement door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through Emma's bruised bones, darkness swallowing her whole as the lock clicked into place, sealing her fate in that cold, forgotten space beneath the house. What Emma didn't know, what Victoria couldn't have imagined, was that the blind old man Emma helped wasn't just any stranger on the street, but the CEO of Hartwell Industries, the very company where Victoria had clawed her way to a senior management position through manipulation and carefully constructed lies. The CEO had recognized something in Emma's voice, a purity that reminded him of his own daughter, lost years ago, and he made it his mission to discover who this compassionate young woman was and why she carried sadness like a second shadow. When he learned the truth about Victoria's treatment of her stepdaughter, when he connected the dots between the girl who saved him and the woman who terrorized her, what he did next would shatter Victoria's carefully built empire and transform Emma's nightmare into something she never dared dream possible. But could one act of kindness truly rewrite a lifetime of suffering? Could the man Emma saved become the father figure she desperately needed? What happens when the person you've abused holds your entire career in their scarred hands? And would justice finally find its way to a girl locked in darkness, simply for choosing light? This story reveals how a single moment of compassion can create ripples that change everything, teaching that genuine kindness never goes unseen, and that power wielded with cruelty will eventually face consequences, showing how courage to help others, even in personal hardship, can unlock doors we never knew existed and bring justice to places where darkness seemed permanent. Emma's fingers had been shaking when she first approached the blind old man at the crosswalk that Tuesday morning. The autumn wind carried the scent of rain and exhaust fumes, and she had watched him from 20 feet away, his white cane tapping uncertainly against the curb as though searching for courage rather than obstacles. She knew what Victoria would do if she discovered this small rebellion, but something deeper than fear moved her feet forward, something that sounded like her father's voice from before the cancer took him 3 years ago, whispering that good people don't look away from suffering just because helping is dangerous. "Excuse me, sir," Emma had said softly, her voice barely audible above the traffic. "Would you like help crossing the street?" The old man had turned his face toward her voice, and though his eyes didn't focus on her, Emma felt seen in a way that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. His hand had reached out, weathered and spotted with age, and when she took it, she noticed how it trembled, not just with frailty, but with something that felt like relief, as though he had been testing the world, and she had been the first person to pass. "Thank you, young lady," he had said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed at odds with his vulnerability. "It's rare to find such kindness these days. May I ask your name?" Emma had hesitated, years of Victoria's conditioning making her reluctant to offer any piece of herself to the world. But something about this man felt safe, felt right, and so she had whispered, "Emma. My name is Emma." They crossed together, her hand steady under his elbow, guiding him around a pothole and between the rushing cars that seemed annoyed by their existence. On the other side, the old man had paused, turning his unseeing eyes toward her, with an intensity that made Emma wonder if blindness was really just another way of seeing. "Emma," he repeated, as though committing it to memory. "You have a gentle soul. I can hear it in your voice. Don't let the world take that from you, no matter how hard it tries." She had wanted to tell him that the world was already taking it, that her stepmother's cruelty had carved out so much of who she used to be, that sometimes she barely recognized herself in mirrors. But the words stuck in her throat, and instead, she had simply smiled, forgetting that he couldn't see it, and said, "I'll try, sir. Have a good day." The walk back to Victoria's house had felt like walking toward her own execution. Emma had known, somehow she had known, that her stepmother would discover this small act of defiance. Victoria had a way of knowing things, as though the house itself reported Emma's movements, as though the walls whispered secrets to the woman who owned them. Victoria's car had been in the driveway when Emma returned, its engine still ticking with residual heat, and Emma's stomach had dropped like a stone into dark water. Her stepmother should have been at work, at that important company she always talked about with such pride, the place where people apparently respected her and valued her opinions. But instead, Victoria stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed over her designer blazer, her perfectly made-up face twisted into an expression that promised pain. "Where were you?" Victoria's voice had been quiet, which was always worse than yelling. The quiet meant calculation, meant punishment that would be measured and methodical rather than explosive and brief. "I just went for a walk," Emma had said, hating how small her voice sounded, how it turned her into a child rather than the 18-year-old woman she legally was. "You just went for a walk," Victoria repeated, her heels clicking against the tile as she moved closer. "I specifically told you this morning to stay inside. I specifically said that if you wanted to eat tonight, you would follow my instructions. But apparently, my instructions mean nothing to you. Apparently, you think you can just do whatever you want in my house. I was just helping someone," Emma had tried to explain. But the first slap had cut off her words, Victoria's hand connecting with her cheek hard enough to snap her head sideways. The beating that followed had been worse than usual, Victoria's fury compounded by something Emma didn't understand. Some stress from work or some perceived slight that had nothing to do with Emma, but would be paid for with her blood anyway. Victoria's nails had dug into Emma's arms, leaving crescents that would bruise purple by morning, and her fists had found Emma's ribs with precision that suggested practice, knowledge of exactly how much force could be applied without leaving marks that others might see. "You're nothing," Victoria had hissed, her breath hot against Emma's ear as she grabbed a fistful of the girl's hair. "You're absolutely nothing, and the sooner you understand that, the easier your pathetic life will be. Your father left you to me, and that means you belong to me, which means you do what I say, when I say it, or you suffer. Do you understand?" Emma had nodded, tears streaming down her face, her body already anticipating the basement before Victoria dragged her toward the door that led downward into darkness. The stairs had been hard against her shins as Victoria shoved her down them, Emma's hand scraping against the rough wood of the railing as she tried to catch herself. The basement was cold and damp, smelling of mildew and rat droppings, a place where Victoria kept old furniture and older secrets. Emma had been locked down here before, sometimes for hours, once for an entire day, when she had accidentally broken one of Victoria's expensive wine glasses. She knew the dimensions of this prison by heart now, knew where the single light bulb hung uselessly from the ceiling because Victoria always cut the power before locking the door, knew which corner offered the least exposure to the draft that seeped through the foundation. The door had slammed shut above her and the lock had engaged with a sound that Emma felt in her bones, a clicking finality that meant she would be here until Victoria decided otherwise, until her stepmother's rage cooled, or until some other emotion replaced it. Emma had sunk down onto the cold concrete floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, and let herself cry in the darkness, where no one could see her weakness. But what Emma didn't know, what she couldn't have known as she sobbed in that basement, was that the blind old man she had helped across the road was already looking for her. Richard Hartwell sat in the back of his private car, his fingers drumming thoughtfully against his knee as his driver navigated through the city traffic. At 73 years old, Richard had lost his sight to diabetic retinopathy 15 years ago, but the disability had sharpened his other senses in ways that most sighted people could never understand. He had built Hartwell Industries from nothing, had turned a small manufacturing company into a multinational corporation, worth billions, and he had done it by learning to read people through their voices, their word choices, their silences. The girl at the crosswalk, Emma, she had been different. Richard had heard fear in her voice, yes, but also genuine compassion, the kind that couldn't be faked or performed. She had guided him with a gentleness that suggested she knew what it meant to be vulnerable, to need help, to be at the mercy of others. And there had been something else, something in the way she had hesitated before giving her name, as though even that small piece of information was dangerous to share. Richard had made his fortune by trusting his instincts, and his instincts told him that Emma was in trouble, that her kindness came at a cost she shouldn't have to pay. He had pulled out his phone before his driver had gone 2 blocks, calling his head of security with instructions that were clear and non-negotiable. "Find her," Richard had said simply. "Her name is Emma. Young woman, probably late. Teens or early 20s based on her voice. She helped me cross the street at the corner of 5th and Maple approximately 15 minutes ago. I want to know who she is, where she lives, and why she sounds like someone who's afraid of her own shadow." Marcus Chen, Richard's head of security and a former FBI agent, had been with the CEO long enough to know that when Richard Hartwell asked for something, it got done. Within 2 hours, Marcus had used traffic cameras, facial recognition software, and good old-fashioned detective work to trace Emma's route back to a house in a quiet suburb, a house owned by Victoria Brennan. The name had made Richard sit up straighter in his office chair. Victoria Brennan. He knew that name. She was one of his senior managers, a woman who had climbed the corporate ladder with impressive speed over the past 8 years, someone who had a reputation for being ruthlessly efficient and politically savvy. Richard had always felt something off about Victoria, something that didn't quite align with the competence she displayed in meetings, but he had never been able to put his finger on it. "Marcus," Richard had said into his phone, his voice tight with suspicion. "I need you to dig deeper on this. Victoria Brennan works for me, which means Emma might be related to her somehow. I want to know everything. Family connections, living arrangements, any complaints or concerns from neighbors, and I want it by end of day." What Marcus discovered had made Richard's blood run cold. Emma was Victoria's stepdaughter, the daughter of Victoria's late husband, who had died 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer. Neighbors reported hearing shouting from the house, had mentioned seeing Emma with bruises on occasion, but no one had called the authorities because Victoria was careful, because the abuse was always just subtle enough to create doubt. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who lived next door, had been more forthcoming when Marcus had knocked on her door with questions. "That poor girl," Mrs. Chen had said, wringing her hands. "I've heard her crying through the walls more times than I can count. Victoria, she's all smiles when people are watching, but I've seen how she treats Emma when she thinks no one's looking. There was this one time, maybe 6 months ago, I saw Victoria shove Emma so hard she fell down the porch steps. But when I asked if Emma was okay, Victoria laughed it off and said Emma was just clumsy. What could I do? I'm just an old woman. and Victoria is important, has a big job at some fancy company. Who would believe me? Richard had listened to Marcus's report with growing fury, the kind of cold rage that had made him legendary in business circles for destroying competitors who crossed ethical lines. But this wasn't business. This was personal. Because Emma had shown him kindness when she thought no one was watching, when there was no reward for it, when it would actually cost her dearly. And Victoria, the woman Richard had unknowingly employed and empowered for nearly a decade, had beaten that girl and locked her in a basement for the crime of being good. The CEO had made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for James Patterson, his general counsel, and one of the few people Richard trusted without reservation. "James," Richard had said, his voice carrying the weight of imminent action. "I need you to prepare termination papers for Victoria Brennan, senior manager in our operations division. I also need you to contact Child Protective Services, or whatever agency handles adult dependents in abusive situations. And I need you to prepare a full compensation package, something substantial, for a young woman named Emma, who I'm going to ask to come work for us once we get her out of hell." "Richard," James had said carefully, knowing his boss well enough to recognize when Richard was operating on moral conviction rather than business logic. "What exactly is going on?" Richard had told him everything, his voice shaking slightly with anger as he recounted what Marcus had discovered, how the girl who had helped him cross the street was being systematically destroyed by one of Richard's own employees. James had listened in silence, and when Richard finished, the lawyer had simply said, "I'll have everything ready within the hour. What else do you need?" "I need a police escort," Richard had said. "I'm going to that house personally, and I'm getting Emma out of that basement. Victoria Brennan is about to learn what happens when you hurt someone I've decided to protect." The sun was setting when 3 cars pulled up in front of Victoria's house. Richard sat in the first vehicle, his jaw set with determination, while Marcus and 2 other security personnel emerged from the second car. The third vehicle carried 2 police officers who had been briefed on the situation and had obtained an emergency welfare check warrant based on Mrs. Chen's testimony and the evidence Marcus had compiled. Victoria had answered the door with her professional smile in place, the same smile she used in boardroom meetings, but it had faltered when she recognized Richard Hartwell standing on her porch. Her brain had clearly been working overtime, trying to understand why her CEO was at her home, why police officers were behind him, what this meant for her carefully constructed life. "Mr. Hartwell," Victoria had said, her voice pitched perfectly to convey confused deference. "This is such a surprise. Is there something I can help you with?" "You can tell me where Emma is," Richard had said, his blind eyes fixed in Victoria's direction with uncanny accuracy. "And you can tell me right now, or these officers will search your house from top to bottom until they find her." Victoria's mask had slipped for just a moment, confusion and fear flickering across her features before she regained her composure. "Emma, my stepdaughter? She's probably in her room. Is there a problem?" "The problem," Richard had said, his voice dropping to a register that made even the police officers shift uncomfortably, "is that I know exactly where Emma is. She's locked in your basement because she committed the terrible crime of helping a blind old man cross the street this morning. That blind old man was me, Victoria. The girl you beat and imprisoned is the same girl who showed me more kindness in 5 minutes than you've probably shown anyone in your entire life." The color had drained from Victoria's face so completely that she looked like a ghost, her mouth opening and closing without sound, as her brain processed the impossible coincidence, the catastrophic mistake she had made. The police officers hadn't waited for further discussion, pushing past her into the house and following Marcus's directions toward the basement door. Emma had heard the voices upstairs, muffled and indistinct, and she had pressed herself into the corner of the basement, terrified that Victoria was bringing someone down to hurt her further. But then the lock had clicked, the door had opened, and light had spilled down the stairs like salvation itself. "Emma," a voice had called, male and unfamiliar. "Emma, my name is Officer Rodriguez. We're here to help you. Can you come upstairs, please?" She had climbed those stairs on shaking legs, her eyes adjusting to the light, and when she reached the top, she had seen her stepmother standing in the hallway with an expression of absolute defeat on her face. But more surprisingly, she had seen the blind old man from the crosswalk, the one she had helped just hours ago, standing in her foyer as though he belonged there. "You," Emma had whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "How did you find me?" Richard had smiled, a gentle expression that transformed his weathered face. "I told you not to let the world take your gentle soul, Emma. I meant it. And when I discovered that the world trying to take it was someone who works for me, someone I had unknowingly empowered to hurt you, I decided it was time to do something about it." Victoria had tried to speak then, her voice desperate and pleading. "Mr. Hartwell, please, this is all a misunderstanding. Emma is troubled. She's difficult. She needs discipline." "Discipline," Richard had interrupted, his voice cutting through Victoria's excuses like a blade, "is not the same as abuse. Discipline does not involve beating an 18-year-old girl and locking her in a basement. Discipline does not leave bruises and break spirits. What you've done to Emma isn't discipline, Victoria. It's torture. And it ends right now." The police had taken Victoria away that night, arrested on charges of assault and unlawful imprisonment, her protests echoing down the street as neighbors came out to watch the woman they had always thought was so professional, so successful, so together, being placed in the back of a police car in handcuffs. The company she had worked so hard to climb within would terminate her employment the next morning, her career demolished as thoroughly as she had tried to demolish Emma's spirit. But Richard had stayed with Emma, sitting with her in the living room of the house that had been her prison, listening as she told him everything. Years of abuse spilling out in words that had been locked inside her as securely as she had been locked in that basement. He had held her hand, this blind old man who saw her more clearly than anyone ever had, and he had made her a promise that would change her life forever. "You're going to come work for me, Emma," Richard had said, "not as charity, but because I see something in you that my company needs. Genuine compassion, real kindness, the ability to notice when people need help. I'm going to pay for you to finish your education. I'm going to give you a position at Hartwell Industries, and I'm going to make sure that you never have to be afraid again. You saved me this morning, not just by helping me cross the street, but by reminding me that good people still exist. Let me return the favor." Emma had cried then, but these tears were different from the ones she had shed in the darkness of the basement. These tears were made of relief and disbelief and the first fragile shoots of hope that had grown in her heart in 3 years. She had helped a stranger at a crosswalk, expecting nothing in return, and that stranger had turned out to be the one person with the power and the will to save her from a nightmare she thought would never end. 2 months later, Emma sat in an office on the 20th floor of Hartwell Industries, her nameplate reading, "Emma Hartwell Collins, Community Outreach Director," in letters that still made her smile every time she saw them. Richard had not only given her a job, but had legally adopted her, becoming the father she had lost and thought she would never have again. Victoria was in prison, serving a 5-year sentence for aggravated assault and child abuse, her appeals denied, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. Emma's job was to develop programs that helped vulnerable people in the community, to identify those who needed assistance and ensure they received it, to be the kind of help for others that she wished she had found sooner. It was work that fed her soul, that took the suffering she had endured and transformed it into something that protected others from similar fates. On her desk sat a framed photo from the day Richard had officially adopted her, both of them smiling at the camera, his hand on her shoulder, in a gesture that promised protection and love. Below the photo was a small plaque with words that Richard had given her on her first day of work, words that Emma read every morning before she started her day. Kindness is never wasted. It plants seeds in dark places, and sometimes those seeds grow into forests that change the world. Emma had learned that one act of compassion, one moment of choosing light over darkness, could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. She had helped a blind old man cross the road, and in return, he had crossed the chasm of her suffering to bring her into safety. Her stepmother had beaten her for showing mercy, unaware that the person Emma helped was the CEO of the company Victoria worked for, unaware that her cruelty would be the instrument of her own destruction. Justice had found its way to a girl locked in darkness, simply because she had chosen light. And that light, once nearly extinguished, now shone bright enough to guide others out of their own basements, their own prisons, their own despair. Emma had learned that the universe keeps better accounts than we imagine, that genuine goodness creates protective forces we cannot see, and that sometimes the person we save turns out to be the only one who can save us back.